Damn, what is that, bro?
Hey, how's it going YouTube? This is Devin coming back at you with another video today on Pub Slump MTG, and with this video today, I'm going to be going over the cute and adorable Tinybones in Commander. And this Commander was suggested to me by one of my patrons, McSaucy, where he wanted to see a build around Tinybones specifically. From time to time, I will take recommendations from my patrons when I make new videos for deck techs or other types of videos. So again, thank you McSaucy for the suggestion on Tinybones. And what I like about this Commander specifically is you could use all three different versions of this card, and the deck will essentially function the same because all the deck is focusing on is discard, which I know is a bit of a salty strategy to a lot of different people, but I noticed recently in Commander that a lot of people have a lot of card draw engines, so kind of taking them down a notch can be helpful in your strategy. So again, whichever one you choose for your Commander, I feel like each of them are going to be very good for the deck. I particularly like the new Tinybones Bauble Burglar. Whenever an opponent discards a card, exile it from their graveyard with a stash counter on it. During your turn, you may play cards you don't own with stash counters on them from exile, and mana of any type can be spent to cast those spells. And Tinybones does have an activated ability by paying 3 and a black and tapping it. Each opponent discards a card, activate only as a sorcery. So this is pretty much just an engine. I like this for the fact that you could make people discard so that you could have essentially 3 cards in your hand. I know they're technically exiled with stash counters, but you could essentially play them and get some value out of that. So pretty much it's just pay 4 mana, tap them, and draw 3 cards. But the first iteration of Tinybones is also another excellent choice. This one is great because it does give you a source of card draw. At the beginning of each end step, if an opponent discards a card this turn, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. And you can pay 4 and 2 black. Each opponent with no cards in hand loses 10 life. That could be a game ender in a lot of different situations, especially if nobody has cards in their hands. So I like this option as an engine. And the last one I feel like is better in the 99. Tinybones the Pickpocket has Death Touch. And whenever it does deal combat damage to a player, you may cast a non-land permanent card from that player's graveyard, and mana of any type can be spent to cast that spell. So this one's great. Again, I think it's better in the 99, but if you want to throw it in as your commander, I think it's good because of course you're focusing on making people discard. You just deal some combat damage with that Death Toucher and potentially cast a spell. So like I mentioned previously, you could build around any of these and I think it would do great, but if I were to rank them specifically, I would rank Tinybones the Pickpocket last, Tinybones Trick and Thief second, and Tinybones Bauble Burglar at first. So now that I've talked about the commanders of the deck because you could use any one of them, now let's talk about the cards of the 99. So of course the main theme will be discard. There's so many different options for discarding. Since Tinybones looks like a fun guy to play around with, let's play a game with, well, play a game. This has a great ability, choose one. If there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, choose more than one instead. Creatures your opponents control get -1/-1 until end of turn. Each opponent discards 2 cards, and each opponent loses 3 life and you gain 3 life. Each of these modes will benefit us. Of course it's a mini board wipe, not big of a board wipe enough, but like you could get rid of people's Land of War Elves that they would probably chump block against our Tinybones. But most importantly, each opponent is going to discard 2 cards, and depending on which Tinybones we have on the battlefield, it's going to benefit us even more. Another option that I think is fantastic is Bandit's Talent. For 1 and a black, it's an enchantment class, which you basically level up with the more you pay into it. When it does enter, each opponent discards 2 cards unless they discard a non-land card. And if you pay 1 black mana to go to level 2, at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if that player has 1 or fewer cards in their hand, they lose 2 life. And when you level up to 3, at the beginning of your draw step, draw an additional card for each opponent who has 1 or fewer cards in their hand. So all this for 2 mana is quite ridiculous. Obviously you're paying more into it to get more abilities, but this is just an enchantment that's going to be sticking on the battlefield. The first ability is a one-time effect, but when you level up to level 2 and level 3, it's going to be affecting each beginning of upkeep, whether it's your own turn or your opponent's turn. So cards like this are going to ensure that we have stuff going on all the time. That does include other cards like Painful Quandary and Oppression. Each of these basically have that ability, like for example with Oppression, whenever a player casts a spell, that player discards a card from his or her hand. And I do think Painful Quandary is a little better, even though it does cost 2 more mana. Whenever opponent casts a spell, that player loses 5 life unless they discard a card. So if somebody just has a big giant storm deck, well, they're going to be casting a lot of spells, but most likely not anymore because they're not going to be having any more cards in their hand. Another static effect, if people aren't really casting too much spells, is Necrogen Mists. For 2 and a black, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player discards a card from his or her hand. That does include ourselves, but that's completely okay. We're technically getting card advantage depending on which Tinybones you're are going to be using. And this just happens statically at the beginning of each player's upkeep, so I think this is another great fit. A similar card to that is Bottomless Pit. This is a fantastic card because it really randomizes the game. During each player's upkeep, that player discards a card at random. That does apply to us, unfortunately, but again, it's not as salt-inducing as like a Painful Quandary because this effect will happen to us at random. Another option I find fascinating is Siphon Mind. This is a card draw option and also making people discard a card. Each other player discards a card. You draw a card for each card discarded this way. So if you have 3 other opponents, they're going to be discarding in total 3 cards, and then you're going to be drawing 3 cards. So this is a fantastic value, especially with Tinybones. But let's keep that aggressive strategy going with Rankle, Master of Pranks. This is an excellent card because it's very versatile. It does have flying and haste, and when it deals combat damage to a player, choose any number. Each player discards a card, each player loses 1 life and draws a card, and each player sacrifices a creature. So this is basically just a group hug effect minus the hug. I think the versatility of this is very underrated. You could choose any number of them. You don't even have to choose any one at all if you just want to go in for some combat damage. But I like this as removal, card advantage, and of course the theme of the deck, making people discard cards. And the last card in this section that I wanted to talk about is Dark Deal. This is incredible in the deck. Each player discards all cards in his or her hand, then draws that many cards -1. So if you have the Bauble Burglar as your commander, essentially when people discard their hand, those cards become your cards, and you get to draw new cards on top of that. Because we are making people discard cards left and right, we want to gain those benefits outside of our commander. There's so many other options that we could take advantage of. For example, Waste Not is an excellent include. Whenever an opponent discards a creature card, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. Whenever an opponent discards a land card, add 2 black mana into your mana pool. And whenever an opponent discards a non-creature, non-land card, you draw a card. So this is just giving us so many different options, putting bodies on the battlefield, adding mana, and getting us card advantage. Another similar card focusing on card advantage when people discard cards is Geth's Grimoire. For 4 colorless mana, whenever opponent discards a card from his or her hand, you may draw a card. So if you have one of those effects where each player discards 2 cards, which trust me, there's plenty of them in this deck, you'll be able to draw 6 cards off of the static ability on the artifact. So this is just another great value piece in the deck. And speaking of value, Aklazad's Deepest Betrayal is excellent. It does have an attack trigger for each opponent discarding a card, and of course if they can't discard a card, you draw a card, so you get that additional value. And whenever an opponent discards a land card, you make a bat token on the battlefield, and if it does die, you flip into the Temple of the Dead, which you can flip back and forth to Aklazad's. So this is just an engine putting tokens on the battlefield and potentially drawing you cards. I love this option for the deck. Another card I find fascinating is the Raven Man. This is an excellent choice because at the beginning of each end step, if a player discarded a card this turn, create a 1/1 Blackbird creature token with flying, and this creature can't block. And this is a discard outlet. Each opponent discards a card, activate only as a sorcery when you pay into that cost. So there's just another way we can flood the board with some tokens and also have a discard outlet. I did also want to touch on Torach's Dread Cantor. For 1 and a black, it does have kick or 2 black mana. It has protection from white, which could be pretty relevant, especially from a Swords to Plowshares. Whenever an opponent discards a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Torach. So this could get extra huge depending on how much people are discarding cards. And when it does enter the battlefield, if it was kicked, target opponent discards 2 cards at random. So this can make people discard cards. It could get buffer in the game, and it does have protection from white, so if somebody's playing a mono white deck, you could probably go in for some combat damage with it. Another option I wanted to focus on is Hostile Investigator. For 3 and a black, when it does enter the battlefield, target opponent discards a card, but most importantly, whenever one or more players discard 1 or more cards, investigate. This ability only triggers once each turn. So what I like most about this is the fact that you could essentially make this act as card draw because you just investigate. You could sacrifice those tokens to draw cards. But now I want to shift focus and talk about the best of the best cards that you should definitely add into the deck because they're going to provide so much value for you. One like the Haunt of Hightower can act as a win con for you. It does have flying and lifelink with a 3/3 body. Whenever it does attack, defending player discards a card, and whenever a card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, you put a +1/+1 counter on Haunt of Hightower. So going back to that situation, if we make each opponent discard 2 cards, we get to put 6 1/1 counters on Haunt of Hightower, making it a 9/9, and of course when it attacks, somebody's going to have to discard a card again and make it a 10/10 with flying and lifelink. That's going to gain you so much life in one instance. I also do like Abyssal Harvester. This came out of Foundations, but this is an excellent choice because it has that tap ability. Exile target creature card from a graveyard that was put there this turn, create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a nightmare in addition to its other types, then exile all other nightmare tokens you control. So for one, this is great graveyard hate. You could just tap it, exile a creature card from a graveyard, and of course you get to make a token copy of it that's a nightmare. That is going to be extremely huge, especially if somebody has a disgusting card that they put into their deck that they just discarded. We could just make a token copy of it and potentially control the game that way. And if you truly, and I mean truly, want to be degenerate, Tergrid God of Fright can be very salt-inducing to a lot of different people, and it can be pretty disgusting using in this deck. If you want to lose friends, this is an option for you. So of course, going back to that scenario, each opponent discards 2 cards, and if they were permanent cards, you get to put them on your side of the battlefield with Turgid on the battlefield too, and then after that, you'll have to find a new play group. But if anything else, you could use it for the backside so people are not so salty about it. Target player loses 3 life unless they sacrifice a non-land permanent or discard a card when you use that tap ability, and you can untap it by paying 3 and a black. So you could utilize this card, but without people being too salty if you want to use the backside. And of course, how could you not forget Tinybones joins up? After all, this is the Tinybones deck. You need to include this just because it's an enchantment on the battlefield for 1 black mana. When it does enter the battlefield, any number of target players each discard a card. You could include yourself if you aren't in that reanimator strategy, because you could use cards like reanimate to reanimate other creatures from your opponent's graveyards or other effects like that. But it also does have another ability. Whenever a legendary creature enters the battlefield under your control, any number of players each mill a card and lose 1 life. So this will provide utility for us because we do have a lot of legendary creatures in this deck specifically. But if anything else, just for 1 black mana, each player is going to be discarding a card. That's great value. So with all that said, that is going to do it for me, guys. Thank you guys so much for coming by and watching this video on Tinybones. Any version can helm as the commander of this deck because each of them are essentially doing a similar thing. I mean, they are doing something different, but obviously the main focus of this deck is discarding. Again, I do believe Tinybones, Bauble, Burglar is the best out of the bunch, but let me know down below in the comments which Tinybones would you build around. And again, I would like to thank my patron Mixasi again for giving me the suggestion and for being a loyal patron. And if you do want to join the Patreon, I do have the link down below in the description to see which option's best for you. But if not, that's okay. If you want to, hit that like button and subscribe. That's definitely one of the best ways to support the channel. And with that out of the way, thank you for stomping by.